When you were doing evangelism for Java, what was like the process for you to go and actually talk about it, build that developer community? I know you built it from like a few thousand people to like a few million people, which is insane.
Java was the winner at the time. It really became the standard programming language for college students around the world. The most famous Sun founder is probably Vinod Khosla. He founded Sun Microsystems, and he's probably done the best for himself building Khosla Ventures, subsequently, and a venture fund that was dedicated to funding early Java language-based companies.
Decentralization as a vision hasn't really been achieved. Bottom line, are you still investing in crypto?
You build this concept called the attention economy. And I think as soon as attention becomes economic, then essentially what happens is that there's an externality of attention exploiters. When you look at things like the split between the haves and the have-nots, it really comes down to asset ownership. That's kind of the mindset around decentralization, which is, what if there were logical economic ways for people to fractionally participate in the economies for which they belong? I'd say the easiest way in is to understand kind of longitudinally my background. So I guess if you want to go really deep to the very origins, I would say I got my start in computing really in, I would say, high school. It was 8-bit computing and just the introduction of the essentially home computer. So this was the dawn of personal computing in the 1980s. So that would make me Gen X. And my first home system was a Atari 400 8-bit computer. It had 16K of RAM, which is smaller than most GIF images that you'll see on the internet. It's absolutely very, very minimal system, right? But kind of going forward from there, I actually grew up in the Midwest. I got involved in essentially online communities really early, pre-internet. So I was doing dial-up bulletin board systems using essentially phone modems. So that was pre-internet computer networking. And then when I got to the University of Michigan, I actually built a communication system for our student housing cooperative. So we were using essentially mainframe terminal-based computer communication, this thing called the Michigan Terminal System. And then eventually I went to from University of Michigan to Yale in the neuroscience program. And this was in the early 90s, and the kind of craze then was the pendulum swing from essentially cognitive AI, which was really Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert at MIT. They were working on essentially cognitive AI, and then the pendulum had fully swung. And I think the big popularizers are essentially Rumelhart and Hinton, right? Jeff Hinton, who I think everybody recognizes as the Nobel Prize winner. Even though he didn't invent error backpropagation, or pre-training, but he did popularize them, and he has been a long-standing champion. I found my way into AI and connectionist systems through his 1986 paper, which is about error backpropagation. And, those fundamental techniques are what people refer to when they generally say machine learning. Obviously, there are other machine learning techniques, but the absolute dominant form of life right now is transformer-based pre-trained generative AI, which is essentially classical backpropagation of error plus the transformer function. So that was kind of my graduate school experience. And then I sort of went on. I came to Silicon Valley, worked on really early pre-internet and internet online communities at the Well, which was Stuart Brand's Whole Earth electronic link service, pre-internet online community, and then eventually worked at Wired magazine on the internet side. At the time, it was called Hot Wired. That was around '94, and then eventually, I found my way to Sun Microsystems to work on the Java programming language. And, at that juncture, I left kind of application development and I got more involved in basically developer platform marketing and evangelism. So I think at Sun Microsystems, I caught the startup bug thanks to this. But Sun Microsystems partnered with a venture capital firm called Kleiner Perkins, which was sort of the .com big VC at the time, and launched this thing called the Java Fund. And so working on the Java Fund kind of got me excited about venture capital. So I really spent about 25 years in Silicon Valley doing mostly developer tools and open source software, and essentially working on really the go-to-market and marketing side of that business. And eventually in 2018, and for the past 8 years, I've been working on essentially open source financial infrastructure, aka blockchain and these technologies in the form of Gumi Cryptos Capital, which is we're on our second fund out of that vintage. And, it's been more a flip from the entrepreneur side to the venture capital side. So I guess that's a bit of a longer intro, but I just wanted to reflect on kind of the deeper roots and kind of the feeling of trajectory and, lifelong interest and passion. So I just want to introduce myself that way so that we can kind of dig in anywhere you want.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And I have so many questions, starting with what is a Java fund? Or like, what was the Java fund at the time?
Absolutely. So basically what had happened at the birth of Sun Microsystems is that there were a number of really high power technical founders, business founders, right? And, obviously some of the probably the most famous Sun founder was probably Vinod Khosla. And so he founded Sun Microsystems, and he's probably done the best for himself building Khosla Ventures, subsequently, and, being an early investor in things like OpenAI. So Vinod Khosla was definitely hugely influential. At the time, he was at this venture firm called Kleiner Perkins. And, since they essentially got rich on Sun Microsystems, they were excited to collaborate with Sun on launching a venture fund that was dedicated to funding early Java language-based companies. So it was a sort of a pure play startup venture capital fund, but with sort of a strategic emphasis and with a sort of vertical, essentially programming language thesis-based approach to essentially what at the time was .com based software investing, right? Which is really the birth of the consumer internet and, investing behind all of the trends in the consumer internet.
Amazing. And how have you kind of seen Silicon Valley evolve from, what it was back then to now? And do you see any parallels between, back then to now with the AI boom and in the middle?
Yeah, no question. I would say that from the parallels perspective, for sure, that Silicon Valley, and San Francisco has for a long time been sort of a boom town, right? And when you go back to the history, right, obviously the professional football NFL team here is the 49ers, right? So if you go back to 1849, there was this gold rush, right? And obviously San Francisco was built on top of this gold rush, and really seminal brands like Levi Strauss and these kind of, very classical brands, that's still like the Haas family anchors the Berkeley, business school, so the heart of San Francisco is really based on these roots, right? And so in a way, and if you kind of look at the course of San Francisco, for example, there was in the early 1900s, the earthquake and fire. So San Francisco has seen big cataclysmic busts, obviously, that's dramatic, right? So that earthquake and fire almost destroyed the city. So the city has this quality of boom and bust. It's a very, very strong boom and bust cycles, right? So, as such, it's built on this premise, right? So if you compare historically the .com boom, this is definitely a comparable boom. And in fact, one of the things that we've noticed is that it's a pretty major, it's something close. Definitely don't quote me on this, but you might want to ask how much of the GDP is now AI driven, and when I say AI driven, I'm really talking about directly attributable to either hyperscaler expansion or investment growth, into AI and AI related companies, including XAI, which is a very large economic expansion, a multi-trillion-dollar, IPO. So if you look at the total amount of expansion, it is reaching as a percentage of GDP more than what was attained during the height of the .com boom. So, I think the parallels do exist.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think SF in general is also quite a resilient city, despite all the
Very,
buzz, it always kind of
very.
comes up. And I think that's the beauty of it as well. And then for you personally, when you were doing evangelism for Java, at the
Yeah.
time, what was that like? What was like the process for you to go and actually talk about it, build that developer community? I know you built it from like a few thousand people to like a few million people, which is insane. But what was that experience like and how did that happen?
I mean, one of the things that's super important to kind of understand is that was very singular. It was a very singular time. One of the incredible things to discover is that everybody everywhere was inventing different fragments of Java. So really, in a sense, Java was the winner at the time. It really became the standard programming language, for college students around the world, right? So it really became this deep understanding. And, it's effectively one of the really crazy things I do want to remember from that time is that it was a time where people were pretty wildly optimistic, especially people who were in San Francisco, who were kind of part of this, I would characterize as technology wave. Um, and, if you look at it from that perspective, in some ways, we failed to meet some of the hopes that we had for the internet, right? We really felt that the internet was going to be really a way to interconnect people, to sort of essentially reduce and, possibly even largely eliminate ignorance, and to really provide essentially free education to anyone with an open mind, right? So there were definitely a lot of really powerful aspirations, and while there are a lot of good things that have come out of the internet, we couldn't really have predicted how easy the internet is to be used for fraud or deceit, or so it's pretty full now of things that are deceptive and fraudulent and not that optimal. So we that was something at the time we didn't really predict. I mean, with respect to kind of the evangelism and development of the technology, I mean, you could really look at kind of the mindset that you see reflected in what Gary Tan at YC talks a lot about, which is he talks really about product market fit, right? So in a way, if he's talking about things like if you're getting involved too much in things like churn management, then you have a product problem, and you can't do things like hide the unsubscribe button to save yourself, right? Like you need to fundamentally look at the product market fit, right? And the reason why I'm reflecting on this is that, I definitely can't take credit for the expansion of Java because the product itself was the perfect product for the time, So in a sense, it's really a movement to be a part of, and to really be an active and visible supporter and spokesperson. But I would say that it was a rocket ship, so it's definitely a privilege to be there. I mean, it really was the right product and tech at the right time, and I think for me it was really easy because having struggled, I built my first error backpropagation, system in C++, right? And if you've spent a lot of time debugging C++, once you reach Java, you realize that a lot of really good choices were made, and you really get excited about it. So that, in a way, like just translating that excitement into activity was pretty easy for me.
So interesting. And then from there, how did crypto come about for you? So you started working on Gumi in 2018.
Yeah. So really, when you really look at the time scale of it, right, I had already started working on crypto and crypto related projects, as early as like 2015-ish. Obviously, when you go back, it's not that OG, right? Because when you really look at the earliest signs, right, the Bitcoin white paper publication was really post 2008 and the kind of crash of Lehman, and this kind of a really explosive toxic asset relief and all of the kind of things that came with the essentially that huge recessionary bubble, right? That happened on top of the essentially subprime mortgage and mortgage derived security bubble, right? So that was kind of this catastrophic collapse of the economy. And then shortly thereafter, the publication of the Bitcoin white paper in the October of that year, and then the essentially the Genesis block being I think it might have been January of 2009, right? So so it really wasn't until 2015-ish or so where I started getting interested in it. And then to give you a sense of kind of how kind of late-ish I was, the way I became really actively involved in this is I went to the Coupa Cafe in Palo Alto, and they had a Bitcoin checkout, so you could basically buy your coffee or tea, using Bitcoin, right? So the fact that this thing existed in a retail setting is a sign that it's actually not early. It's actually kind of late, right? Because it means that's a consumer product. Now, if you go there now, they actually don't have that, and it turns out that but the reason why this attracted me to get involved is, like with any new technology, the first impulse is to just play, right? And so part of my play effort was I began GPU mining, right? Because ASIC mining hadn't taken over Bitcoin. It was still GPU based. So I started GPU mining Bitcoin, but really only with the hopes of being able to buy a free cup of tea. So that was kind of my experiment, and it was interesting because at the time ASIC mining had just started coming in. So I wasn't a very good Bitcoin miner, but it helped me sort of really deconstruct the protocol, and it really helped me understand this, essentially cypherpunk phenomenon, and starting to kind of decode the words of Satoshi Nakamoto and the kind of philosophy. And, that got me very interested because, and in a way I would say I've been a reluctant cryptographer because my background is much more in the AI neuroscience background rather than in the blockchain cryptography background. So I would say that cryptography is sort of more like a reluctant choice for me, but I do feel like, in a way, because the internet has gotten, I think, a bit bad, we actually need to strengthen the rails, we need to strengthen protection, and we need to be able to have more integrity. And I think, AI is basically, despite it being a really wonderful and powerful tool that I use all day, every day, it does contribute to wealth inequality and some amount of social disruption. So I think it's something where we need mechanisms to provide things like individual privacy, and cryptography is useful for this, and sovereignty and power decentralization. So I think that's otherwise, you know, if you look at cyberpunk and cypherpunk, right, they're pretty inseparable. And obviously, the people who identified as cypherpunks were obviously riffing on cyberpunk. And when you look at cyberpunk fiction, authors like Neil Stevenson, William Gibson, they're all pointing to a future where there's sort of overwhelming corporate power, and that corporations are, like if you look at the movie Blade Runner, the Tyrell Corporation has the patent on human replication, and that they've started using human replication for kind of a form of like slavery. And, and they're the most powerful corporation in the world, and they're kind of a menace, right? So, I mean, obviously that's science fiction, but when you look at the culture of cypherpunk, the cypherpunk culture is based on decentralization, right? It's really based on the idea that there must be mechanisms that enable power to be decentralized, or else we'll end up in a dystopian future. So that's really the cypherpunk movement and what they're trying to attain. So, I found that philosophically, I became interested in some of these principles. I will say in hindsight, there are some principles that restrict the Satoshi vision from being civilizational infrastructure. So there's definitely hindsight on what was built. But, I do think that it's been a really deep and meaningful exploration into, essentially individual sovereignty, privacy preservation, and, really asset custody. So it's a really interesting space for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, the ethos of crypto, as you described, was very much around decentralization. But of course, in the last few years, we've also seen how decentralization as a vision hasn't really been achieved. And
Yes.
a lot of the, you know, problems that are associated with crypto are mostly, founders launching tokens, rugging, and things like
Yes.
that. But do you think still culturally or still fundamentally crypto or the cypherpunk culture is something that you believe in?
Yes. I mean, I think that there are a couple of things that I think are really, really important to note, right? Which is that, I think Satoshi Nakamoto, when you study the writings, there's a really nice book called The Book of Satoshi that kind of compiles a lot of the writings of Satoshi Nakamoto. I highly recommend people read and digest and understand it as a historical artifact. But when you really look at the design of things like the identity system of crypto, it really is self-styled in the sense that you have the first wallet in blockchain is essentially the Satoshi wallet, and it's based on a pseudonymous identity, right? And so when you really look at it, what happened is that the blockchain identity system replaced government fiat identities essentially with a self-asserted fiat identity. I think that gave rise to sort of more like a libertarian philosophy, and it kind of has this sort of like extreme individual sovereignty. But there are certainly kind of case studies where it pushes society into a pretty complex spot, right? So I think for me, there needs to be an identity system that better navigates the combination of the needs of individuals with the needs of society itself. And I think that there are some extreme postures around sort of privacy as an absolute right, which I think is perhaps problematic from a civilizational infrastructure perspective, right? So I would say, in sort of scrutinizing the way the infrastructure is built, I would say that there is a need for essentially a better mechanism for identity, or else we will fall back to the traditional KYC government fiat identity system, which is what seems to be happening, right? Which is that so-called regulated crypto is all based on KYC, KYB, which is essentially government identity, which is not really cypherpunk at all. So
Yeah, yeah, the vision is going further and further away. But, bottom line, are you still investing in crypto then?
yeah, of course. I mean, we definitely are excited about the potential for it. We absolutely are excited about really how this class of technologies is a huge enabler, and we do see need for increased decentralization. One of the things that's complex about things like decentralization and privacy is that, end users tend to be wildly willing to give up privacy, sovereignty. They tend to be willing to give up everything in exchange for things like convenience, right? And so that's really been sort of a downfall, and it's sort of been an enabler for the build out of an internet that has a substantial amount of toxicity and externalities in it. And I think one of the things that's a really strange externality is sort of a purely advertising driven internet, which I think has caused a lot of weird dynamics, because ultimately, as soon as you have an advertising revenue based internet, you build this concept called the attention economy. And I think as soon as attention becomes economic, then essentially what happens is that there's an externality of attention exploiters, right? So it turns out that it really favors the most extreme, the most shrill, the most hysterical, the most kind of crazy, because those are the ones that get the most attention, right? So if you think about the externalities, that is problematic, and that in a way there is a future in which we arrive at an internet where we have almost like a true exchange of value, and we have a true mechanism for not only just paying for value, right? Whether it be things like microtransactions or something that's much more kind of organic, right? Because what happened is that payment has always been effectively out of band of the internet. There's not been an internet-based payment protocol, right? It's really like, if you look at something like Stripe, right, it's really mostly been payment protocols that are outside of the internet, right? So, I think the vision of there being an internet protocol for payment is really, that is in band and, is native to the internet, I think required incredibly deep efforts, right? Because one of the things that's true is that open source software has been around for a long time. But one of the things that Bitcoin created is that it enabled this concept of almost like an open source runtime, right? Which is effectively that because mining pays for itself, it means that you can actually open source the runtime, right? And it's always been the case that the runtime has been the cost and that the software has been made free, right? So in the sense of Bitcoin, that's one of the ways. I think you originally asked me kind of how did I get interested in this stuff? And that was really it, right? Which is that if you look at the rise of open source software, this is really the last mile, which is it's always been the software is free, but operating the software has always been this heavy cost. And what Satoshi cracked was a mechanism through which the project could mint its own money and then use the money minted to pay for basically servers. So that, that's exceedingly clever. And I think that, we're definitely going to see more systems that operate in this way.
Yeah, no, definitely. Actually, funnily enough, in 2024, I was also working on a very similar problem where we were doing decentralized compute and working on that, and actually hit a lot of roadblocks at the time, which was our idea was basically, say you have free processing power on your laptop or your GPUs or whatever.
Yep.
You can actually rent that to someone who needs it, and you get tokens for the project as payment for that. But yeah, I think distribution was obviously a problem, and so a
I
lot of
think it's logical. I definitely think it's logical. I think that it is definitely a challenge. We are starting to see things that are non crypto token based that are starting to push into the very edge of such systems, right? Which is there's some NVIDIA partnerships with some companies like Enphase, right, that really install H200 class GPUs into residential, right? So this idea of kind of residential AI compute data center is kind of a really interesting reaction and a mechanism where you're starting to see more potential for truly decentralized compute. I do think one of the ways in which this becomes sort of finally realized is through, again, open source software, which is really frontier class, open source, open weight AI models, right? So I think if you have that combination, then what happens is that the demand swings into things like local compute, and you end up with really cool opportunities for local compute, things like data sovereignty through models that are a bit more like OpenClaw, and the idea of kind of local compute with local open weight models becomes, I think, feasible and privacy preserving, and effectively more sovereign. Now, whether that's backed by a cryptographic decentralized ownership token or not is a separate matter, right? But if you go back to kind of the roots, I mentioned that I helped to develop a student housing cooperative and communications network over a mainframe, in my undergrad days, right? So, one of the things that's really interesting is when you think about this idea of a housing cooperative, right? You're really taking a rental-based cash inflow and you're converting the rents into ownership. So it's an ownership-based model, right? And I think that increasingly there are opportunities for that, right? Because when you look at things like the split between the haves and the have-nots, right, it really comes down to asset ownership, right? So I feel like in some ways it's incumbent upon society to come up with mechanisms where we can do a better job decentralizing things like ownership, right? And that's really, and doing so within the context of a token, I think is a logical thing to do, but like it doesn't necessarily have to work like that. It could work a different way, right? But I think the fundamental problem still exists, and I think obviously there's proposals. For example, like OpenAI has proposed that the United States government own 5% of its stock, or, so there are definitely things like sovereign AI fund proposals, right? So there's proposals underway that would involve sort of people's ownership of these frontier tech companies, right? And that would potentially enable I would say to rebalance to some extent this sort of K-shaped economy, and I think that's, I think those things historically what's happened is sort of that the upper leg of the K is able to control the political apparatus and that they're able to essentially spin the flywheel to their advantage, right? And obviously when we look at it historically, the answer to that has been things like violent overthrows, right? So like, I think that's probably not a great system. Like we probably need a system where there aren't violent revolutions against overlords, right? So that's kind of the mindset around decentralization, which is what if there were logical economic ways for people to fractionally participate in the economies for which they belong, right? Like young people are paying rents, and they're not able to own, and that feels really problematic, right? It feels like an entire generation is locked out of financial ownership, which, in some ways, I think things like crypto and Bitcoin have been part of that cultural movement, where young people have felt locked out of land ownership, and that their reaction is to embrace things like digital asset ownership, as almost as a reactionary behavior.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because so I split my time between Singapore and New York, and I think Singapore, in some ways, has done a decent job of, making things like ownership available to its citizens.
Yeah.
But I think the way they do it is so messed up, though. I don't know if I can say that and keep this on the podcast, but you know, so like for example, for something like land ownership, technically there's guaranteed housing for um, if you're a citizen of Singapore, but the only catch is you can only apply for it when you're under 30 and as a couple. You can't apply for it as a single person. So
Yeah, Singapore has a pretty strong agenda for their own population growth. So they have, at the time I was there some while ago, visiting, not living there, but like they had special programs for young people to go on. Like the government was funding these romantic cruise getaways so that
yeah.
young people could like have more kids and things like that. I mean, it really was very heavy handed and really interesting. They also had a research based program where they had billboards encouraging Singaporeans to smile, right? And it was based on this very, very good quantitative study that helped to quantify the impact of smiling in Thailand to their tourism. So some very kind of research person in the Singapore government decided that they could increase tourism by trying to make Singaporeans smile more, right? Which is, so that was kind of this very, it's funny, right? Like it feels like that's a part of the Singaporean way, right? Which is, it does have to do with sort of, it's a little bit centralized and a little bit paternalistic and a little bit authoritarian, but it seems at the scale they're operating, it seems pretty effective in a lot of ways. And I think they don't underpay government employees, right? So when you look at,
No.
they pay industry competitive wages, which means that the government is really talented and is coming up with these ideas, right? So it's a very thoughtful, technological kind of Star Trek style, government in some ways, and in other ways somewhat authoritarian. So it's an amazing country for sure. Very, very impressive, and it's really and very ethnically diverse too. So
Yeah.
in a way they've navigated ethnic diversity I think in a pretty reasonable way. So hats off. I'm definitely like a fan. I think it's a impressive governance.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think they're very practical in everything they do. Even things like ethnical diversity. They've like taken five of the top ethnicities and they're like everyone gets two holidays and you have like 10 public holidays. And so it's
Yeah,
very like, it's just a very practical city. But
it
in
is
general, I
very
think
pragmatic.
they've done a good job in terms of making sure people feel like they still have access to ownership for a lot of things, but at the same time, you have to like follow the rules to be able to access that ownership, which is an interesting way to.
I think in dipping into Singapore, I think really the broad themes that we're trying to touch are how can we look at these emergent themes of economic populism as a response to centralized power? And how can we really look at building better civilizational infrastructure, right? And I think the idea of decentralized ownership, decentralized governance, I think these ideas are still needed and are deep parts of civilizational infrastructure. And I think from my vantage point, we need to find solutions, whether they are crypto tokens or whether they're not tokens. We definitely need to find ways of funding common interests, and also to ensure that we have a stable, advanced, and productive and beneficial society, that is essentially financially inclusive and functions really ideally. So that's really the way I see things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think decentralization while simultaneously having that access to economic ownership and things like that is super important. And yeah, I think the last question I have for you is, from a fund perspective, what are some things that you're excited about for 2026, 2027 to invest in? What are some things that you're looking at right?
Yes. So, really, I think that ultimately, from a venture perspective, there are problems and solutions, right? And the thing that really I think is important is that as we see the AI revolution taking off, in some ways, we're seeing increased pressure on privacy. We're seeing increased pressure on centralization of power. We're seeing a lot of these increased pressures. And ultimately, one of the things that I think is reflective of this kind of mood of a downturn in the blockchain industry is that the amount of pressure on things like privacy and sovereignty are also a little out of step with some of the sort of energies within the space, right? Which is when you look at open source software is software that is designed to last forever. And so the design horizon of open source software is forever. But I think that a lot of people entered the space with the get rich quick mentality. And so I think the idea of getting rich quick is fairly incompatible with the idea of building software that will endure, and become a permanent part of civilization for all generations, right? So to me, it really just means that the technology will endure and that the problems that AI solves are actually pretty wonderful and it solves them really well. But AI will also create new problems. So part of our excitement in investing is that what we know that people who are disheartened by the get rich quick schemes and the scams and all the short term thinking are actually creating an opportunity for people who are long term thinkers, because we think open source software will continue. And we think that these kinds of sort of perpetual systems like Ethereum that are built for the long haul, will absolutely be civilizational infrastructure and will continue to support new applications that are badly needed. And AI will create even more need for decentralization, things like individual privacy and sovereignty. So these problem areas aren't going away. They're actually getting much worse. And so, I think that's going to be exciting to see how it develops.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think with AI, also the timelines are getting so much shorter. It's like every few months there's something new coming out, which I think is super exciting. And it's very hard to track as well, but it's super fun. Uh, but yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. And we think that AI is deeply having a huge impact itself on software production. About 4 to 8% of GitHub commits are authored by Claude, not just AI, but just even one vendor. So it really
Wow.
is a seismic impact. And I think that this impact is going to be generational. And I think if the output is better software, I think that's great. And by the way, not all pull requests generated by Claude are better software, right? Some of them are much worse, but it's fine. Like, the internet has survived, and GitHub has survived. GitHub is one of the last bastions of sort of the virtuous internet, because there's so much peer review and there's so much scrutiny, and bad code tends to just die, right? Like, the vast majority of GitHub is not that useful to most people, and so as sort of a meritocracy, it's sort of the Darwinian matrix for software. So, I welcome all pull requests, good and bad, and let them all compete in the market, right? So, people complain about things like slop, but it's like, that's fine, and it's any combination of human only, human plus AI, AI only, like, just let it all go, and let's see what's good, what is good software. And, and I think for sure there's good software being built. So, like, Boris, who's the product manager for Cloud Code, said that Anthropic has increased their per engineer code output by 250% with no measurable drop in quality. So, like, and obviously they're a unique engineering organization, but, I think that's a benchmark, and, I hope other organizations can do the same.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, such wild times we're living in, but also so exciting.
Yeah.
So yeah, those were all the questions I had. Thank you so much for joining today. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks very much.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Off the Record. If you like this episode, like, subscribe, and leave a review. It helps the podcast grow. You can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.